All right, I don't have a prepared statement or anything. We didn't, have meetings here, so I'll just take questions if that's all right.
When do you anticipate commencing formal collective bargaining with the league?
Oh, I don't know yet. There'll be some, obviously some preliminary discussions to set things up and talk about things, and we'll get that done at some point down the road. Obviously, my preference is going to be when we get to the really significant sessions to do it at a point in time, which is rather more likely to have players present easily than less. But, we'll know, I think, sometime in the next few weeks how that's going to play out.
So it sounds like after the season then, if you want.
No, I wouldn't say that necessarily. I wouldn't say that.
Does the union still need more information from the league before you can sit down and really have some talks?
Well, there are a bunch of things that obviously we're going to want to get some more information on, yes. And as a matter of fact, often when you get into bargaining, issues will arise and you'll look for more information mutually during the course of bargaining and so on. So I think the answer to that's yes. If you ask it a different way, is it anything that would be unanticipated or unusual or outside the scope of things that you would expect in bargaining of this type? I think the answer is no.
Is there an understanding or a belief that the books you have, the finances of the league both the PA and the league agree on right now? Bill Lilly was saying they've been very transparent.
With respect to the information we get, I think that certainly hope that's largely true. But there's significant information we don't have. We have overall revenue numbers for almost all things. That's what HRR consists of. And we have the player cost numbers. We don't have the rest of it.
So that would be
Well, the rest of it is whatever their other expenses are and all the rest of it. Profit and loss and those kinds of things rests on the overall operation. You can't segregate out the player costs as if that was everything.
But don't you have the right to look at the books of a certain number of teams, don't you, per year?
But only within the context of the HRR review.
And you'd like more?
Mm-hmm. Look, all I can tell you at this point is that when you get into bargaining and you try and figure out what the issues are going to be and how you frame responses and how you make proposals, one of the things you'd like to have is a comprehensive understanding of all the money flow on all issues. That makes things vastly easier.
I'm sure that you'll want to discuss the issues with them before you address them with us. But
Probably, that's right.
But I'm curious.
Courtesy, if for no other reason, yes.
Exactly. But I'm just curious to know what the mood is like right now.
What the mood?
The mood, the players. What there's, I mean,
I think it's business. Well, I'm sorry. The mood of whom?
The players right now, as they get set for September 15th and that deadline.
Well, I think, a couple of things. First of all, you're getting into the second half of the season, you're getting into the playoff run and all the rest of it. I have yet to meet a professional athlete that when things really became to be on the line didn't focus on that almost to the exclusion of everything else in the world, and these guys are no different in that regard. So they're focused on that. They are understanding the lead up. They do focus on what we talk about during meetings. We have had a series of meetings, have a whole bunch of others planned to get player input, to have discussions, to raise issues, to see what kinds of things are more or less important, to make sure that on a staff level we're not going down a road that they don't agree with, or that because some of us are new to the culture, we're doing something that doesn't make any sense. So we've got a lot of that stuff to do. In terms of their response, I think it's focused. I think it's businesslike. I think they're getting ready. I think that obviously when their playing commitments for this year end, that will give them a lot more time and opportunity.
Tom, is that maybe the biggest?
You guys are losing out. What?
Is that maybe
I'm all right.
the biggest question right now in terms of getting?
I'm sorry.
Is that maybe the biggest question right now in terms of getting started, finding a date?
Well,
with players.
Let me caution you. There is this view, I think, that somehow if you have a big formal meeting and everybody comes and takes pictures of a dozen or 2 dozen or 6 dozen people sitting around a table like the auto workers used to do, that somehow magically that signifies the kickoff of something in a formal way and that the world is different as between before and after. That's largely untrue. And so, we'll get to that when the appropriate time is. Doesn't mean there won't be a lot of work, a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion before and on an ongoing basis after that. Don't make more out of it than is there.
You're meeting with Gary this week?
Yes, I am, but I do that regularly. Mm-hmm. It's not unusual.
Do you believe that there's an entire remake of the system that needs to be done, or is this a small negotiation? What's your view on
I'm
that?
not in a position to comment on that yet, and won't be until we get significantly further down the road. We get what we think is a sufficient understanding of everything, discuss that with the players, and determine what they want to do. So it's a premature question.
What do you think the appetite is from the players?
Sorry.
The quick and easy handle from the outside is that, given that the NBA and the NFL downgraded the players' share from revenues, that's what they're going to try to do to you guys. What do you think the appetite is from
So
you?
you've been spun. And the reason I say no, the reason I say that, no, the reason I say that is, and I'm not going to try and draw conclusions for you. I'm simply going to point out there were 3 negotiations. The third one was baseball. There are no caps. There is much more sophisticated and detailed revenue sharing. They went through the third negotiation in a row without a stoppage, the second one without a hint or a suggestion of it, without deadlines being set by anybody. And baseball is far and away, on a labor relations standpoint, the most stable of the 4. There's no question about it at this stage. So if you're going to look for role models of what you might want to emulate, I'm not suggesting that you ought to draw this conclusion. I'm suggesting not to eliminate it from the analysis. Mm-hmm. You know, it's sort of easy to say they did this in football, they did this in basketball. Gary came from basketball, so obviously that's what he's going to do. I've said this any number of times, and I don't mean to exclude that from the realm of all possible things. Certainly it is possible they'll try and do that. But the negotiations are self-contained. The ownership is different, the nature of the sport is different, the economics of the 4 sports are different. We use the same words, free agency, salary arbitration, revenue sharing, but they don't mean the same thing between sport to sport or even contract to contract. So let's be a little careful. From my own standpoint, you know, obviously I hope we don't go down that road because we saw what happened in the other sports. Well, you can. A lot of your union members? Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I guess the best way I can respond is this. I don't think anybody will be happy until we can figure out a way to eliminate them, and there are a whole lot of people that, given the nature of the sport, don't think that's possible. So what we've got to try and do is we've got to try and do 2 things. We've got to try and minimize the incidence of concussions to the greatest extent possible, and we have to provide the very best care and precautionary care that we can figure out a way to provide to people, because the effects are not only during your playing career, they can linger. It's an issue in which I hope and I believe the players have a shared interest with the owners in making sure this is done right. We have had a lot of ongoing work done in this regard, jointly through the Concussion Working Group and otherwise. They do their own work, we do. For example, we had doctors that went around to our fall tour meetings, met with the players, explained things, answered questions on an ongoing basis. So, yeah, it's an area of concern. There's no doubt about it. Couldn't be otherwise. But hopefully we're doing everything we now know how to do, and when we figure out other things to do, we'll do those too.
Is this just another regular CBA?
One second.
When you talk about the relative economics, the difference in the economic picture between the
Of
other
the 4
leagues
sports?
and,
Yeah.
and the NHL, the NBA, when they went into collective bargaining, basically had numbers that said that the league as a whole was losing $300 million, and that was the basis for their negotiations, for the proposals that they brought forward. Do you have a sense, having seen the revenues of the various teams, whether or not the NHL has a similar case to make as the underpinning for the negotiations?
The short answer is no, and before we get into that with them, and before we have discussions, the object of which would be, if possible, to come to a common understanding as to what the landscape looks like, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess, and I wouldn't want to comment on it. There's too much of a likelihood in this business that people will extrapolate much too far from casual remarks or remarks that are uninformed, or as far as I know now, X, but, and then everybody forgets the but. That I really don't want to get in. I really don't want to do that.
You mentioned baseball has no cap, and that's is the cap in play? Do you think from the players' side going into this?
I'm not going to get into the economic systems, whether it's the player compensation system or revenue sharing or the mix between the two or anything like that at this point. It's premature to do that.
Is this another negotiation like any other CBA negotiation, or because of what happened the last time, is there a sensitivity perhaps on both sides to the fans and everyone?
I'm smiling because I'm not sure any negotiation is like any other negotiation.
But I'm
It
talking
may
about-
appear to be that from the outside, but it very rarely appears to be like that from the inside. I think they all have their own character. They all reflect the circumstances of the time. They all reflect the opinions of the constituency groups, not the negotiators, the constituency groups, both going into the bargaining and as they develop over time. You know, bargaining in a way is sort of a constant reevaluation of positions based upon what you learn. And so to try and respond to that at this point is just sheer speculation. And, you know, I've learned over time that's not a terribly productive thing to do. So, you know, my constituents, sorry to say my clients, my constituents in closed-door meetings can ask me and say, you know, we pay you, speculate, but you can't do that.
Should the players have a say in relocation and expansion, which is probably going to come up over the course of the next CBA? And should that revenue be something that's...
Well, I will take your word for it that it's likely to come up in the bargaining. Okay, I'm not prepared to make that judgment. And there are all kinds of legal things which... or legal considerations which, you know, go into that. I can tell you that there are collective agreements in which those subjects are specifically addressed. The baseball agreements had them in them for years. Okay, and so if it's something that comes up, it's something we can do. Maybe it'll be something, who knows? I'm about to do what I just told you I wouldn't. He left. You see? What I just told you I wouldn't do, which is speculate, but sometimes it allows you to build bridges because you can find common ground on some issue that you didn't know was going to come up. But until you get to that point, it's really hard to get into the weeds on it. It really is. And they have, you know, a number of things that I'm sure you talked to Gary about that they're wrestling with to try and resolve. I don't know what, for example, the upshot's going to be on Phoenix, but I certainly hope they get it resolved. I certainly hope that they're able to find something and reach a satisfactory conclusion. The indefiniteness of the situation isn't good for anybody.
What about
so
the
I
revenue?
commend him to his efforts.
Do you look at the HRR on that, Don, and philosophically and say, would that be the argument for you?
Players and teams overall would be happier with more rather than less revenue.
Right.
I think that's right, but that doesn't address completely the question as to where franchises should be located. There are other considerations that go
But
into it.
philosophically, obviously, that part of
Well, I didn't say philosophically. I was making a bit of a joke.
I'm not
So
that.
Fehr,
Okay.
I mean, there are fans out there that are baseball fans and hockey fans and
Fans out where?
just sports fans in general that
Oh, okay.
follow both leagues. And
Sure, of course.
I'm not gonna, you know, you probably know this, but you don't have that many fans among the sports fans or baseball fans that have followed that sport
And
over
you
the
say
years.
that based on what?
Well, based on having covered Major League Baseball over a number of years.
Well, let me stop you. I will tell you this. I think I know what my reputation is. And I think my reputation is pretty simple. It is that, you know, we tell the truth, we act in our constituents' interests in terms of what they want to do, and we've been reasonably successful in doing that. If that's a bad reputation, I'll take it.
Well, I mean, from the fans' point of view, I mean, I know you're representing your constituents, but for the fans, it seems like you don't have much compassion or interest in what they're interested in or what they participate in this. From the way that negotiations have gone with baseball, is there anything that you can tell them to reassure them?
Let me just ask you something, since you want to get into the weeds on this. So you think the fans were in favor of collusion in the 80s?
I think the fans are in favor of having the sport being played when it's supposed to be played, and not a year later or half a season later.
So you think that the strike in '94, which was occasioned because the owners broke the law, as the federal courts found, the players you should have said, okay, breaking the law is fine.
I don't think the fans care about anything that's going on. They just want the game to be played.
I think that, in my experience, you just have to pardon me, fans actually care about fairness, and they care about equity, and they care about complying with the law and doing the right thing. And maybe you have a different experience. It's not mine. That's all I can say.
Sorry.
Yes.
Does the NHLPA have its own realignment plan? Are you formulating anything that maybe you could bring to the league and say this might work better?
We don't have anything specific. We did make a suggestion early on in the process that perhaps it might make sense on a one-year basis to swap Winnipeg for a team in one of the other divisions, and then consider it later on. But that was at best a stopgap suggestion. And we now have, obviously, what the owners passed, and if they want to bring it up in bargaining, and I don't know if they will, but I certainly think it's likely, or certainly at least possible, that we'll sit there and discuss it with them.
Don, basically,
You've
worked very hard to establish a kind of consensus among players and consolidate where the union stands. Do you think that's an accurate representation of how hockey players feel regarding the last CBA and potentially this one?
All right, well, in general, I don't discuss my conversations with the players. I never did in baseball either, and I don't try and speak for them when they're speaking on their own. I can tell you that I don't think it's a matter of conjecture whether the players made significant concessions in the last agreement. It was an enormous amounts of money in terms of the wealth transfer over the period of the agreement. The players understand what that was. They understand what happened, and you have to draw your own conclusions from what they say.
You had a meeting with the players here?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Was the CBA the main sort of issue that you're dealing with?
We never talk about what happens in internal meetings. All I can tell you is that I'd be a pretty sorry excuse for a director if I didn't take the opportunity to get a bunch of players in, especially all-stars, and say, here we are, here's what's going on, you got any questions? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? You know, you got to take advantage of the opportunity. Gary has an advantage on me. He can pull a meeting of the Board of Governors together just about whenever they want because they don't have to do something like play hockey games. So I got to take advantage of the opportunities when I can.
John, you came from a very different background, different CBA and all
Different background.
Well, and just in terms of labor negotiations with the NHL CBA versus the Major League Baseball and the difference between the games, and you haven't had an enormous amount of time, as you said, Gary's had an advantage over you in terms of history with the game and labor negotiations here. Correct. Are you ready now, do you feel, to engage on equal footing in collective bargaining, or are you not quite where you want to be? Is there more you want to know? How close are you, do you think?
We will be prepared to negotiate an agreement. Let me just put it that way. You know, I personally am not going to be able to match 2 decades worth of experience and knowledge that comes from that experience on certain specific matters when it comes to the economics, when it comes to how management labor relationships should work or would work and so on. We'll be fine, and I've got staff that knows the other part.
Informal talks have started yet, or not yet?
Well, there are informal discussions about all kinds of things going on all the time, and so on. That's about the most I can say. I wouldn't categorize it as a formal or informal start to anything.
How would you categorize the CBA that's in place right now? What's in place? If you had a couple of words to say about what you saw, how do you like it?
How would I categorize it?
Or how do you like what you see?
It's the kind of it's an agreement. Which was the result of the bargaining which took place the last time, and you know you can draw your own conclusion from that.
And some players
raising revenue through maybe expanding the playoffs.
Well, there has. I can tell you this. One of the issues the players talked a lot about was not specifically that, except in a limited context. It was if you have a playoff access question in which 14 teams are perpetually advantaged in terms of the number of teams in their own division they have to beat to get in. They got to beat 3, then the other 2 divisions they got to beat 4. That's a sort of a permanent unfairness which raises a lot of questions in players' minds. So then you think, well, all right, we do only have 30 teams. We don't have 32. We don't have 28. So how do we do that? And there are a number of ideas that got flown around. There were wild card ideas, there were play-in ideas, there were other ideas that were thrown around, but it was generalized discussion about what might be possible rather than anybody trying to reach a conclusion on it, because the NHL was not in a position at this stage to have those discussions, so we didn't have it.
What's the downside of something like that?
I'm not going to get into that. That I'll save. If it becomes a bargaining issue, we'll talk about it. If it doesn't, then after the bargaining, if you want to ask for personal impressions, then it might be in a different frame of mind, but not now.
Do you expect it to not get revisited again until collective bargaining begins?
No, I don't know. We've indicated to them that if they want to look at it again, we're still willing to sit down and talk to them about it. But at this point, I don't have any expectation that it will. It's one of those things. I don't think, by the way, as an aside, there are a lot of people that have made public comments suggesting that the particular discussions we had, either on the HRR resolution or on realignment, are necessary or likely precursors to the course of bargaining. I just don't think that's true. If it is, it'll be coincidental. These are the kinds of things you go through in the ordinary administration of a contract, and we did. You know, nothing personal about it on either side, as far as I can tell.
Are the players satisfied with the supplemental discipline process?
You're going to need to ask the players. You're going to need to ask, in particular, the players. I got to ask about philosophical questions. I will, simply say this at this point. Whenever you have a system in which somebody can say, I conclude, more or less as a prosecutor, that there's a violation of the agreement and you have X penalty and the penalty is substantial, and you don't have anything which resembles what anybody in the U.S. or Canada would call due process, philosophical issues which are raised.
Is it possible to have due process in a practical way? I asked Brendan about that, like if we had a panel.
Oh, sure. I mean, there are a lot of different things that you could do to modify the system, but that's not a subject I want to get into today.
Based on your limited dealings with him, what's your feeling of Gary as a commissioner, as someone you're going to be dealing with?
Look, I have known Gary a long time. I knew him when I was, all the way back when I was Marvin Miller's general counsel and he was brand new working for David Stern. You know, it's a long time. We've never been across the table together. All I can say is that his reputation of being smart is, as far as I can tell, exactly right. His reputation of having been in the job long enough to gain a lot of experience in this particular sport and how it works is undoubtedly right. And the fact that he's been there that long suggests that his constituents want him to be there. You know, it's pretty simple stuff. You know, he's a pro.